I would like to introduce you to a new book that has just come out, Influences and Distortions of the Gurdjieff Teachings. A book that I feel is very important in our time because of the muddying of the waters of these teachings, which once were so underground for serious seekers hunting a truth that was transformative, and that inevitably, even prophesied that way from Gurdjieff himself, was taken over by charlatans, criminals, predators, lunatics, people utterly disconnected with the origins and ultimate purpose of these teachings, which some of you know can be traced back to instructions to monks in Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So that ultimately this fourth way brought to a secular West in the 1920s was inevitably a profoundly spiritual method for human beings to find their way into consciousness of the divine. And yet, in our time, there has been such a radical and dramatic desecration of these teachings. Gurdjieff established the Prieuré, the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, in Fontainebleau outside of Paris in the early 20s. There, his experiment, his mission, his effort to seed the West in its time of dissolution. World War I had happened, ahead of us was World War II, and then everything since then. In this place, some of the greatest minds, most expansive, open minds of the time came. A.R. Orage, Maurice Nicole, so many profound seekers and thinkers that influenced the birth of the New Age, really, and have spread ideas into all sorts of areas, such as cognitive therapy and many other psychological insights into human nature, initiated right here in this strange, esoteric, outside of mainstream world. Here, Gurdjieff taught in a way that was often harsh, demanding, yet profoundly compassionate, in aiding people to break away from pride and illusion and false personality, recover authenticity, essence, free themselves from wrong work within, inner considering, worried about what others think, all of that. With a master's touch, he created conditions for people to find what ultimately is the divine seed within. There were many obstacles that he had to overcome. Gurdjieff was a force of nature that had to make it through the Russian Revolution, across the Tibetan Himalayas, through the Caucasus Mountains, being shot 3 times, being in a deadly car accident, surviving to the amazement of the policemen who found him there. All this to bring to you and I teachings that we could initiate, integrate into daily life, regardless of how disconnected our lives have become with deep truth, sacred tradition, ancient knowledge. There was a purity of motive, a goodness of heart behind all of the strange, unusual, creative activity to reach the human soul in this day and age. But he knew what would happen. And at the time of his death, he said, "I leave you all in a fine mess." Because sure enough, that first generation was incapable of transmitting these teachings with the kind of paradoxical heart that Gurdjieff brought to it. And so it began within a decade. A man like this shows up by the name of Alex Horn, who marries an English woman who had had some exposure briefly to J.G. Bennett, one of Gurdjieff's students, who had already deviated off on his own shortly after Gurdjieff's death. This man, a psychopathic narcissist of the highest order, created a group in San Francisco called the Theater of All Possibilities, in which people were brutalized, literally, physically, in which he made a fortune off of his students, in which the manipulation was so obvious and crass, and yet wrapped in fourth way teaching, calling on Gurdjieff himself as the reasons for his behavior, even though he had never had any exposure to a teacher, only books. Alex Horn leaves his wife, who introduced him to the teachings, and marries Sharon Gans, who becomes a teacher all of a sudden, and who will take this wretched, cultish, secret organization into even greater heights of perversion. By 1978, they must leave California because they are exposed for who they are and how they are treating people, only to reappear in New York City, in Manhattan. There, Sharon Gans starts her own group among the wealthy and continues a shockingly distorted, degraded misrepresentation of the teachings of Gurdjieff, of Moise Nicole, of Uspensky. She becomes this person who is now made known to the world through recent books revealing what happened, how such profound methods of inner transformation became opportunities to manipulate people, to crush them, to destroy them, making an utter mockery of not just the fourth way, but even the roots from which it comes, which ultimately go back to one Yeshua. This is sin against the Holy Spirit. Not just calling good evil, making evil out of good. And then in that school back in San Francisco, for a brief time they had a student by the name of Robert Earl Burton, who was kicked out because he was too perverse for the perverse school. And this man absorbed and understood how one Alex Horn tricked people, used people, abused people, all with the veneer of the fourth way teachings. And so he did the same and created the Fellowship of Friends with fine art and culture and the best writings of humanity, uplifting the students into preserving an arc of culture for the coming destruction of the world, while working on themselves. It made him amazingly rich, and he turned into a sexual predator of unparalleled abuse. So he learned how to use all of these ways to manipulate seekers, young people hungering for God, vulnerable, open to risking everything to find their way to truth, to becoming, to transformation, so that he could literally rape them. This is a level of criminality that has great consequences on a cosmic scale. So he became this royalty of a guru, of a cult, a leader, hiding behind Gurdjieff's original ideas. Another video details my experience with this group, the Fellowship of Friends, which I was able to move beyond, whereas other friends remained for decades, finally escaping with most of their lives damaged by this individual and the trickery and evil he learned at the feet of Alex Horn. It is astonishing that such degradation, distortion could occur in what was so precious, so powerful, spiritual uranium for the soul, brought at tremendous personal cost into our lives by George Ivanovich Gurdjieff. But the very fact that it came through esoteric circles, that it was not able to establish a foothold with real teachers in the next generation, remained on the outskirts, hidden, unconnected with the great traditions, made it vulnerable to such abuse, and is part of why there was such sadness in the man's eyes. This is why this book has importance in our time, highlighting the dangers, the pitfalls, and yet recognizing the value that is there for those on the inner path. And so I share this with you as a flashlight in the dark, as a map to a treasure that others have sought to steal, and yet which remains a legacy, an inheritance, a possibility for each of us. May you find your way to the light that it reveals.